Hello, everybody. Hello and welcome to the Sentinel Innovation and Methods Seminar Series. I'm Judy Morrow at the Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare Institute and Harvard Medical School, and I'm moderating today's session. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration Sentinel system helps to address questions related to safety and efficacy of marketed medical products. The Sentinel Innovation Center focuses on developing innovative methods to further advance Sentinel by leveraging new data sources and enhancing real-world evidence capabilities through advanced analytic methods. The Sentinel Operations Center focuses on supporting FDA in the use of the Sentinel Common Data Model and its associated modular programs or tools to gather evidence to support regulatory decision-making. We launched this webinar series to engage experts and innovators in key areas related to the Innovation Center's master plan and the Operations Center's work. With that, I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Sarah Alwardt. Dr. Alwardt is Vice President at Untitled Operations, which is an oncology-focused subsidiary of McKesson. Prior to joining McKesson, Sarah worked for 10 years at Humana, which is one of our data partners. She also served 2 years as an adjunct professor of chemical engineering at the University of Louisville, where she received her doctorate in chemical engineering. The title of her presentation today is Measure What You Treasure, the challenges and opportunities of collecting real-world data points. Before we get started, I'd like to remind everybody that your lines are muted. If you'd like to pose a question, please type it into the Zoom question and answer feature. We will be answering the questions at the end of the session, and this session is being recorded and is being made available through the Sentinel webpage, which can be found at www.sentinelinitiative.org. And without further ado, I'd like to thank you, Sarah, for joining us and welcome you to turn over and begin your presentation.
Thank you, Judy. Thanks for the invitation to speak today. So to start out with, imagine a world where real-world caution becomes real-world confidence. And this is introducing Ontada. So first of all, thank you all today. I do want to talk about measure what you treasure. And this is going to be a slightly different view of many of the previous seminar series. So I look forward to spending some time with you all this afternoon. And thanks for coming along on the journey. I am a bit of a storyteller. I will say that up front. And so many of the slides will be talked to, not read. And so I appreciate the attention. So just getting right into it, I'm going to start with a little bit background of Ontada. So this is probably a name many of you haven't heard before. Who is it? What are we doing? Why am I here talking to you all today? Then I'm going to spend some time talking about real-world endpoints and challenges and really kind of some of those traditional endpoints that we deal with. What are some more contemporary endpoints? How we think about some endpoints in the future and thoughts for Sentinel. What's going to be a little bit different for today for me, and I thought a lot about what I thought might be impactful for today's seminar, was thinking through things from the physician standpoint. So across the presentation, I'm going to share a number of screenshots on how data are entered into the EMR that my team uses, and hopefully in giving some background, I'll begin to explain some of the context for that and why we think that is so important to furthering the discussion around real world evidence. And just as a caveat, I think one of the largest kind of undiscussed, unstated biases that are in real world data today is understanding what happens when the physician is doing clicks in an EMR and what their context is. So we'll talk a little bit about as we go through. So first, I spend all the time in community oncology. So everything that I'm going to talk about today is going to have a very oncology lens to it. And to ground us a little bit, I wanted to talk about the community oncology landscape and how that is becoming so much more complex. So again, storyteller, my first story. If we think about non-small cell lung cancer and my team, as you can imagine, with the advancements in drug pipeline and therapies that are being developed and therapies on the market today, so it's a space of a lot of activity, and that's probably an understatement. But if we go back 50 years or so, lung cancer was an anatomical disease, and you were at the top of your game if you knew how to do surgery. So you had surgical oncology, you took out bits or a whole lung, and that was absolutely top of your game. And that it really didn't change really 1979. So in 1979, there was a seminal paper in the New England Journal of Medicine on use of platinum-based therapy in the treatment of lung cancer. And to be a top of your game oncologist, you really had to read that one paper. Didn't change again from a breaking therapy standpoint till the mid 90s. So mid 90s, you had the approval of docetaxel, which all respects today is just a very aggressive drug. I mean, that's a rough one. But again, simple, single, just a couple of publications that as a physician, you were top of your game if you read those publications. If we fast forward another couple of years, another decade or so, we got 2010, we have the advent of immuno-oncology and IO therapy in the treatment of non-small cell lung cancer. And that's gone from 2010 to today. And that one paper that a physician had to read in 1979 is hundreds of papers in the first quarter of the year to be top of your game in non-small cell lung cancer. It's gone from one disease to at least 11 different diseases. Look at pipeline, it could be as many as 15 different diseases. And we think about, from my standpoint, the context of community oncology and what that actually means. So we have a community oncologist who their first patient of the day was breast cancer, their second was glioblastoma, their third was a leukemia, and their fourth is non-small cell lung cancer. So how do we make sure that the patients who are receiving care in the community, where most patients are receiving care, are getting top of the line, absolutely the most informed, evidence-driven care that they can get, and making sure that those 11 different diseases in lung cancer are understood and tested for, and we can take advantage of that advancement. The scary thing is, and this is where we have space to go. If we look at 5-year survival in advanced non-small cell lung cancer, it's still less than 10%. So we've come a long way. We have a lot more to go. But all of the data and evidence that's being generated in these disease spaces have to become actionable for the physicians, and because they're the ones that are generating the real world evidence that we analyze for tomorrow. So when we talk about the complexity of oncology, that is my example for some of the things that we're up against in complexity, and that not only data entry and analysis, but utilization of those data in practice. So on the flip side of this, I spend a lot of time talking to biopharma and our clients in biopharma, and they're having several jobs that need to be done too, with a different set of data needs and a different set of jobs that the data need to offer. So thinking through patient care being the first one. The next one, we're doing everything from preclinical research to the development process and trials to pre-launch and launch, and ultimately growth and in brand maturity and competitive space. And putting all of these things together, data are powering everything across this biopharma life cycle. So when I think about our work in my previous world with Humana and our work with Sentinel, and thinking about very, very scoped purposes of data, and then thinking about how real world data are kind of used very broadly, I like thinking about bringing them together and having a common data capability that rises all boats, so to speak. So thinking through a slightly different lens and how data are powering the life science partnerships also becomes really a very important thing. From a development standpoint, identification of patients and use in clinical trials could be an entirely different seminar. Maybe that's a different hour. But thinking through how we find patients who are needles in haystacks of haystacks, and making sure that they're receiving access to trial, that they're being incorporated into clinical trials where appropriate, and we're using the real world data to its fullest extent in the trial process. So certainly a number of jobs to be done from a real world data standpoint. If I think about it more granularly and from an R&D standpoint, we're looking at new clinical genomic targets. We're trying to figure out regulatory approval, and we're really trying to figure out, this efficacy, side effects, and safety. And so data are playing a strong role in the R&D process. On the other side of the marketing and approval side, we have commercial teams who are trying to deliver positive patient experience, educate relevant stakeholders, thinking about formularies, barriers to access, payer coverage, these types of things. And it's ultimately the same data set ultimately that is having to power these conversations as well. So I'm stringing this together in a thought of, these are the same data that are powering the different conversations. It's not necessarily unique data sets across the board. On the RWE side, this is where, this is the space near and dear to my heart, but it's also burden of disease, unmet need, patterns of therapy, optimal place, line of therapy. Where are we seeing evidence? Where are we seeing super responders? Where are we seeing non-responders? Trials aren't going to tell us everything. Using real world data to make sure that we're really generating that extra evidence and making sure that as we put together plans for the future and plans for using more real world evidence, making sure that we're having that targeted appropriately and making sure that we're thinking about the right stakeholders and the right qualities of data that are required to answer those questions. So this is where Ontada sits. I said that I would say a little bit about Ontada and who we are and where we fit in the world, but Ontada was recently brought together as a McKesson company. So most people have heard about McKesson. It's a Fortune 7 company. Most of the time people think about gloves and gauze, and when you go to a physician, the box of gloves on the bench in the examining room will say McKesson often. So that's where people think. But McKesson is also home to US Oncology. And US Oncology is one of the largest community oncology providers in the United States. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. But really, Ontada was bringing together the technology. So the EMR technology of iKnowMed and a few other technologies I'll talk about in a minute, and our data and research and evidence business. And we think that by putting them together, we have a gestalt moment where the whole is greater than some of our individual parts, and we have an interesting role to play in the ecosystem. So we partner with life sciences and companies to really advance real world evidence in the ecosystem. And we truly believe that real world data, real world evidence will drive innovation and drive the life cycle. I should have declared very early that I am a real world data evangelist and think that data saves lives. So making sure that we're pulling all of that together to the best use where we're absolutely appropriate, and understanding the strengths and limitations of the data that we're using. So everything starts with the data. I think everything that I'll talk about today is through the lens and with the context of a foundation in data. And I think that the conversation has been interesting over the last couple of years. I think that we're at a renaissance in real world data, but I also think that there's growing interest in defining how to use data and what these data need to look like, and what is regulatory grade data, and what's that definition. And I have tended to prefer to use fit for use, because the data set is only as good as the question you're asking of it, and making sure that it's powered from that respect. So the data set that I'll be talking about in showing how data are captured in the EMR, and a little bit through the lens of our physicians, is really to help life science decision making. It is designed to help regulatory decision making in cases where it's appropriate. It absolutely every single day goes into provider decision making. So we take the role of returning evidence to our physicians very seriously. We believe that, as my mother has said, her daughter's a doctor, but not the kind that helps people. So even though most of the folks on the team have never held a patient's hand in a room as their physician, we believe that the work that we can do absolutely is can accelerate the development of life-saving and life-changing medications, and that we absolutely are improving patients' lives. We believe that the connection of these data into provider decision making is also one of the highest bars that you can put against real world data. If you're thinking that the information that you're going to use and you're providing your physician is going to influence patient care. There isn't a higher bar than that. I think that that flows into some conversation we'll have in just a little bit around what do we capture, and how does an EMR make sure that we're capturing all the elements of information that are going to be useful. And this is real world patient care. The physician isn't going to have a ton of time with each patient. There's like 15, 20, maybe 30 minutes at a way outside that they're going to spend with the physician. So when you think about how much information could be captured in an EMR, and how much has to be interpreted to make sure that the care decisions are appropriate at that time, we spend a lot of time thinking about that workflow and optimizing the number of clicks. I said at a seminar last week, and the physician laughed at me. It's like, most folks aren't going to go around and say they love their EMR. Ultimately, if we're honest with ourselves, this is a device that was, or software that was installed in practices for to make sure that there was a way to pay a claim. And so, when you think about the extra pieces of information that you can gather, they have to be valuable. They have to be valuable to the provider and the provision of care. They should be, most of the time, they should be valuable to the patient, and using that as the first filter. And then ultimately, if the rest of us receive value from those data, that's secondary. But I think it is an interesting and important lens to kind of put at most of the data collection that's happening in the real world that's outside of claims data. So, I've spent a lot of time thinking about administrative data and the opportunities and strengths and limitations of those data sets. And, EMR data aren't different in with respect to having its strengths and having its limitations, but understanding the collection and the context in which the data are collected, I think becomes an important thing. So who are we kind of fitting into the ecosystem? So Ontada, how I've described it is we hold a physician's hand with one of our hands and biopharma with the other. So I know a couple of seminars ago, our colleagues from Flatiron presented to you. We're very similar. It's community oncology. We have a technology. Our networks are different, but we are positioned in the middle to make sure that we're leveraging not only the technology and it's flowing through the providers, flowing through the data, and we're sitting in the middle of this ecosystem. As you can expect, I'm from a data business. Got to show a map. So this is kind of our coverage, and not surprising. These are population centers in the United States. It's not a surprise that there's coverage where the populations are. Community oncology doesn't necessarily mean rural, and I think that that's probably one of the biggest misconceptions. So I'm going to talk about traditional endpoints for a second. I told you a little bit about Ontada, the patients we serve. We're in the community, physicians all over the place, the challenges that come with community, but also the opportunity to study things. And I won't go into this today, but I think that where so much of real world evidence generation is going is not only thinking about what we're collecting now, but starting to think about social determinants of health and putting the patient at the center of the work and making sure that the work is meaningful for the patient. So when I talk about future endpoints, I'll get into that a little bit more. But from the lens of community oncology, this is not necessarily rural. This is just folks not traveling to academic medical centers or hospitals for their care. So traditional endpoints, first of all, I think that there's no conversation on endpoints that doesn't start with where do you find the data, and is it structured data, is it unstructured data, is it found in the claims, or is it an external data source? So I'm not going to drain the slide, but essentially from a longitudinal patient journey standpoint, when we think about what is important and what we think about traditional endpoints, those are these are the diagnosis and staging and payer information, and what was the treatment decision, and where in line the therapy was this, and were the patients tested, and then where did we start seeing changes in lines of therapy, and where did we start seeing either hospitalizations or adverse events, or and ultimately, how do we think about how did we ended up seeing overall survivorship status, and what does that look like in the data set? So these are ones that we're very familiar with. Where we're certainly still struggling to understand a lot of them, and translating from unstructured data to structured data, and then even what the structured data looks like. I think I've spent time with my data science team thinking about how we incorporate common data models into oncology, and we're not quite there yet. So I think that there are great advances and still have some ways to go in adopting common data models, or the common data model across oncology EHR data sets. And I think that's work to be done ahead of us. But thinking through what the patient journey looks like. These are data elements that are commonly collected today, and these are elements that we're very accustomed to seeing. Just kind of a slightly different view when we plot out a patient's kind of journey. We can kind of think about it in a couple of different ways from this is my first measure what you treasure type moment, where it's what are those things that are most important to you in understanding what's happening with the patient, and ultimately what are going to be the most important things for the patient. So I tend to use non-small cell lung cancer as an example. It's certainly the most complex that we're working with today. But thinking through, what are those biomarkers? What is the performance status? How's the patient even doing? What are the therapies they're taking? Are they taking, what is in front line? What's in second line? What does supportive care look like? Are they having other challenges, either adverse events, or are they having anxiety, pain, depression? Are there psychosocial things that we need to be taking into consideration, and then making sure that ultimately the lab testing and other assessments are being continuous. So I tend to like this. I mean, this is an illustrative example of non-small cell lung cancer, but I like thinking about all of this as we're looking at things across a period of time. To give a couple of starting views into the technology. So iKnowMed is the name of the technology that I'll be talking and sharing today. It's in 2 generations. So in many of the slides, I'll have 2 different views to show how we're trying to increase the usability of the EMR and make sure that we're not clicking where we don't need to, because I think that click fatigue is real. But iKnowMed is the EMR that I'll be sharing with. The other piece that's important, and I'll share some of these screens as well, is around ClearValue Plus. And so ClearValue Plus is an NCCN guided decision support tool that sits on top of the EMR. It's invisible. You don't have to go into one system or another. You continuously walk through the EMR system. But I think that this is a great slide to show, because I don't think you really understand the context of data until you can see how it's entered. I think that is like I mentioned earlier, I think that is an important aspect of data that we don't spend a lot of time talking about. So you can see from this, we would require the physician to enter not only the histopathologic type of lung cancer, again, back to the lung cancer as being an anatomical disease. There is one ICD-10 code for lung cancer. So when we're looking at coded data, it ends up being difficult to understand. Did you have even small cell lung cancer versus non-small cell lung cancer? Just very different off of that, but not did you have non-small cell lung cancer that was EGFR positive? So thinking through all of the different biomarker tests that are happening is important. This is required to get to therapy. So this is required to get to a recommended therapy. And so each piece of information that is clicked becomes a structured data field. I think some of the challenges we have with genomic data, and I'll talk about this in a minute, are the unstructured nature that comes along with many of these genomic testing reports. The other thing in supporting community oncology is the ability to understand lab ordering. So I used to be curious where like all fax machines were being used, and apparently all the fax machines that are left in the United States are being used in genomic labs where we print out order guides and fax them to labs. It's unbelievable to me that we're still faxing documents, but a good chunk of biomarker ordering is happening in using the fax machine. So, but we've tried to make it easy to where the physicians in ordering genomic testing and biomarker ordering can click on a lab and the order forms be populated. So they just need to be signed and faxed. That helps. But this is another thing that's kind of making it easy. So the first couple of screenshots. G1 is the older version. You can tell it looks like the older version. And the second one is G2. So this is the second generation. This is the one that's being used today. But first, taking a look at stage of diagnosis. This is an actual screenshot of how a physician would stage a patient. An important thing in how we think about the data is stage happens once at diagnosis. So you're stage once, and that's a stage that you are forever. So if you are diagnosed with stage 2 breast cancer that later becomes metastatic, you do not have stage 4 breast cancer, you have advanced stage 2 breast cancer. So you have metastatic disease. So it's an extensive disease, not a stage of disease. So thinking about the data and for those of you who work with data, it's an important question to ask. So do you stage once, or are the data having multiple stages, to make sure you're looking for the right thing and you're using time periods that can go way far back to get stage of diagnosis. So sometimes the data aren't missing, they're just captured at a time frame before you were looking for it. But kind of going across, you can see that there are options around what type of stage. Excuse me. And then the tumor type, the node, the metastasis. Okay. Excuse me. Moving on to current disease status. So this is kind of the next one that we think about. Is this adjuvant disease? Is this local disease? Is it unknown? Or is it metastatic? So thinking about where you are in the therapy for a patient becomes very important too, because that kind of leads to are you have curative intent? Or how are you thinking about working the patient up the rest of the way? So another view of thinking through, how are you ensuring that when you're identifying patients, is that metastatic disease a structured data field? Line of therapy. So once you have metastatic disease, you can start talking about line of therapy. I'll share some data in just a second around what line of therapy can look like. Often this is an algorithmic conversation. So we did some work looking at what was recorded in the charts and what was the physician's intent around line of therapy versus what an algorithm would say. Just looking at the data, and I'll share that in a moment. But you can imagine that in practice, if you have a patient that was on a particular drug, decided that they couldn't pay for that particular drug and wanted to switch, well, it's not really a second line of therapy. It could be a first line of therapy. It could be the second drug in the first line, and sometimes it's hard to tell from looking at the data. But I did think it was interesting to share, what a physician starts to look at when they're choosing. So often when I'll speak about line of therapy, it is a physician entered and documented line of therapy. It's just off of the screenshot. But in addition to selecting a line of therapy, there are also some free text areas. So in cases where we go back and open charts and go back and look at data, we can, that would be in text, we can get a good idea of what was going on in the physician's head when they were going from one line to a second line. There was an amazing presentation a couple of weeks ago. The Flatiron Health did some date of death concordance. This is a huge thing, and we're in the same boat. when we start thinking about physicians, and if a patient has died, they're not coming into the office for their next appointment. And that sounds kind of stupid or obvious, but we start thinking about, well, how do you know? And looking at the death master file compared to what we saw, the death master file didn't have a tremendous jump in what we were already seeing captured in the data. Most of it was captured as structured data. The physicians and their practices are very engaged with their patients, and they're close with their patients' families in many cases. And so understanding when a patient dies is important to the practices. So we've instituted a couple of things. Now we'll still have loss to follow up. So there are still instances where people just either go to hospice, or they go live with family in a different state and are no longer being treated, and that ends up being difficult to make sure that we're tracking them down. So we have loss to follow up in the real world. But most of the practice have started sending condolence cards and making sure that we're capturing date of death. An interesting story or case study that came out of some work that we were looking at recently was around date of death concordance. And you might have as many of 3 different dates of death. Most of the time they're close, but you kind of would like to have it be on the same date. And this was a story. I had an opportunity to participate in a hackathon a couple of weeks ago, and this was from non-small cell lung cancer patient. She was in her fourth line of therapy and was going to a trial. And she was talking with another patient that there was a big argument on what day a patient died, because they died in the middle of the night. Death certificate wasn't until the next day. So there were 2 different dates. There was the date the family believed and the date that went on the death certificate. It's very morbid to think about, but we need precision in data, and we need precision on what that date is. It becomes significant, and at the end of the day, there are people attached to all of this, and it makes it a very interesting thing to spend some time with. Also thinking about line of therapy, I spoke a little bit ago around the clinical versus an algorithm line of therapy. Pretty much from the data that we looked at, had broad agreement on first line, whether it was using structured and unstructured data, but also understanding what was in the chart versus what was algorithmically. Large agreement in first line. Started to fall apart in second line, and by the time we got to fourth line therapy, there were significant differences in calculated line of therapy versus what was entered in the chart. So in this case, we were understanding that the data source matters, and understanding the context of the data, but also the physicians are the ones that are clicking on some of the structured data. So making sure that there was agreement between what was entered or what was in the notes versus what was clicked by the physician. It's a next interesting challenge for us. So moving towards some more contemporary endpoints, this is a performance status. So performance status, according to guideline for our physicians, is to be entered at every visit. And if it's not entered in every visit, at least it's supposed to be entered when one is initiating a change of therapy. So this is a relatively newer indicator for us that it is of course important to understand how the patients are faring, but an important thing to understand ultimately, if patients are progressing but are feeling terrible, or not progressing but feeling terrible, understanding kind of a proxy for a quality of life as well. So an important new indicator. We also are tracking pain. Cancer pain is incredibly real, hard to treat. The challenges with maintaining proper pain control in cancer that's a whole other seminar too. But making sure that we're measuring it. You know, there are certainly guidelines that suggest that this should be captured at every visit, but making sure that our physicians do, and making sure that we are tracking not only pain management practices for our patients, but that we're capturing those on a scale that can be structured as well. Same thing with depression. So understanding that that cancer has challenges with depression, anxiety, understanding that we've put tools in the hands of the physicians to make sure that they have the ability to capture depression information, make sure that they're referring to the appropriate specialists if a patient ends up being has a positive outcome for depression, and making sure that we're capturing that. When I say that these are more contemporary endpoints to think about, you know, it's the there's a lack of literature growing, but there's still an opportunity around how pain, depression, and overall mental state impacts outcomes. So thinking through the clinical outcome that one might see from a progression standpoint, how is that different between people that are experiencing depression and those aren't, or those that are having managed pain and those aren't. So those end up being important endpoints that we should think about. You know, I've talked about progression. This is definitely something that many of us are spending a lot of time on. Ontada is partnered with the Friends of Cancer Research to think through how we look at real world endpoints and how we use data sets. We've called it together the frenemies of cancer research, because this is cross industry data aggregators and collectors such as Ontada, thinking through how we use our data and how we can put it together in a way that makes sense. We did some work kind of internally looking at across studies that we actually had progression that was collected through RECIST. Now, RECIST is used in almost every solid tumor clinical trial. It is almost never used in practice. So heading in automatically, we're going to have a disconnect between what's used in practice versus what is used in a trial, because this just takes time. And that's not only is it timely for a visit, but the way scans are performed in community oncology, is less structured than a clinical trial. But we took a look at real world progression-free survival, time to next treatment, time to treatment discontinuation, and looked at a number of studies and really found it's all over the place. So depending on which one you chose to think about, you may have overrepresented or underrepresented the actual progression. This is I think one of the challenges that we're all facing right now in thinking through how do we think about endpoints. I mean, overall survival is a complicated endpoint enough even when the endpoint is very concrete. But how do we think about progression, which is arguably more up to timing and interpretation. So transitioning into the last couple of pieces around future endpoints. So genomic data. This is clearly driving lung cancer. I think that we will see this continue into many other cancers. I think that this could end up all of us thinking about cancer very differently. And I talked about lung cancer being an anatomical disease, but the mutations for a particular tumor type in lung cancer, it's the same mutation in renal cell carcinoma. It might be the same mutation in ovarian cancer. So we start thinking about cancers on a mutation level rather than an anatomic level. I think that this is something that we're coming at. But I don't know how many folks understand how difficult this is for a community practice to deal with. So I talked about earlier the challenges around the challenges around even ordering the test, and in most of the time pathology, the surgery or the biopsy happened in the hospital. So the block of tissue is in a hospital pathology, which is not where the community oncology office was. So ordering it, getting the sample to a lab, and making sure that the tests are run. We've performed some studies. We had a readout at ASCO a couple of weeks ago that looked at testing, and the time frames for some of these testings, it can end up being quite a long period of time. So upwards of a month from when a person had a biopsy to when you understand whether or not there's a genomic alteration. And what becomes challenging with that is, we're dealing with a patient with advanced lung cancer. And so at this point, they know they have advanced lung cancer. They just had a biopsy, they had a surgery. There was already some staging that went along with that. There's an understanding of the criticality of the disease. And the physicians are left with saying, we'll know the targeted therapy in a month. So there's a great deal of pressure saying, okay, well, we're going to go ahead and start something. We need to go ahead and start something. And so sometimes you're getting a first-line therapy that isn't necessarily what would have been indicated. So it's an interesting thing. But then on the other side of this, most of the time, at least from the larger labs, clearest Foundation, there is the lab results or the genomic test results come back. It's about a 30-page PDF. So as a physician, how do you get through that information in real time to where it's actionable for the patient when they're in your office, and you don't have to tear off that first sheet because that's not important. And then you're looking at targeted therapy on the second sheet, and you've got 800 things, and some of them are, which ones are better than others, and there's not a lot of data, and how do you think about it? So thinking through how to receive data in structured formats and laboratory integrations, and making sure that, I talked about tying that back to the physician. Ultimately, the data are very valuable to me. I want to understand everything that's going on with the patient from an outcome standpoint. But from a physician standpoint, integrating laboratories into the EMR system and pre-populating data to where they don't have to click and they don't have to go through a 30-page PDF for the physician is tremendously time savings. So I mentioned biomarker testing rates a second ago. We've got a long way to go. Again, when we're looking at data and we're trying to figure out not only what are the outcomes that we're expecting, but how to think about and characterize the data set to make sure that we're looking at it correctly. We're seeing that about 90% or so of the population is receiving some biomarker testing. But if we think about all of the major alterations in lung cancer, you start getting in the 50% of receiving kind of those top 4 or 5. And then if you think about next generation sequencing, less than 50% of patients are receiving next generation sequencing. So thinking through how do we make sure that patients are not only receiving testing, because if they didn't receive the test, then we don't have the data to analyze. And obviously, if they got the test, they're going to make sure that they're receiving the best medication for their tumor if it has an alteration. But on the other side of it is, if they weren't tested, we don't have data to take a look at either. So just a summary of the data points. The next piece, and I think this will be interesting to the Sentinel team, is adding. We've recently updated the software to make sure that we were including not only capture of the adverse event, but making sure that we were capturing the grading of the adverse event. One of the challenges that we saw was in the EMR data is first of all finding the adverse event, but then interpretation against it. So when we're abstracting data, we try and make sure that we're not interpreting or putting clinical relevance or clinical interpretation on top of it. So we are trying to make sure that the physician is the one, or the nurse working with the physician, they're the ones making sure that they're entering the type and grade of the adverse event. We think that that's important to understand. one of the main things that we think about on, measuring what we treasure on this is that, with EMR data at the end of the day, the physicians are the ones entering the data, and they're people, and they're pressed for time, and the EMR is a claims is a means to a payment. So making sure that we take that into account. Thinking through the endpoints that we're pulling together in the community, and that how that flows through to the data, making sure that we're having a patient-centric view and measuring what really matters. If the patient is doing well and they're feeling well and they have an incurable cancer, does it matter at that point if their tumor grew a fraction of a centimeter on the recent scan? And is the physician going to change treatment because of that? So technically, there was progression, but technically also, if the patient's doing well and the doctor thinks they're doing okay, they're probably not likely to change therapy. So keeping these things in context and understanding what really matters. The next part I think that's important here is thinking through the Friends of Cancer research and industry-wide collaborations on real-world endpoints, and the ISPOR-ISPI consortium on reporting of real-world evidence. Spending time with these organizations to help us collectively understand not only the data set that we're using, but how we share that information, and to harmonize on what makes each of these data sets unique. Some thoughts for Sentinel. I couldn't help myself kind of thinking through, the first thing is, I think, through our data collection in the hands of the patient. We spend a lot of time talking about people with cancer, but what is real-time symptom monitoring, and using this today to help with triage and hospitalization avoidance. But this is a treasure trove of information of what's happening in real time with how our patients are doing and how they're feeling, and what all of that means. The other part of this is training. I said adverse events aren't what they used to be. So with a new group of drugs, we have a new group of adverse events to think about and to look for and to train physicians on. And what we see as an adverse event today, we never would have expected to see with a chemotherapy-based regimen. We're really used to seeing febrile neutropenia. We're really used to seeing nausea, but IO therapy and other immunotherapies and the cell and gene therapies, that's not the adverse event. We're thinking cytokine release, and then that's different looking than nausea and fever. So, thinking through that as we go into training is going to make a difference in how we think about and how we collect the data in the future. So thank you for your time. Thank you for being on this journey with me of measuring what we treasure and connecting the EMR to the collection of data points. And this was a lot of information shoved into 45 minutes. So at this point, I'd be happy to take some questions. Judy, it looks like the couple came up in Q&A. I'd be happy to answer.
Yeah, no, I'm sure everybody is really excited to hear your answers. I'm going to start out with reminding everybody that these slides are going to be available on the Sentinel Initiative website, and this is being recorded right now, so you can go back to the website and pick up this recording. That lines are muted, and that if you'd like to enter a question, please put it in the Q&A box, and we will get to it. And if we don't get to it, we will follow up with you after we've gotten Sarah to answer it. So to start off, Sarah, I'm going to start with one of the clarification questions
Sure.
that we've had. About whether they understood correctly that you talked about the concordance between the structured data that the physician is entering and then the unstructured data, and how well you're checking to make sure that that information matches.
Yeah, I didn't get into a lot of that on these slides. It's actually pretty good. So for kind of a broad information, every time we do a study, we'll go through and we'll sample a number of data points from the unstructured data to make sure that what we saw in the structured data was correct. There are instances of, you click the wrong thing, but most of the time there's actually a high level of agreement. The difference generally comes in that the level of detail that you're capturing in structured data is just so much less than what ended up in the text box right next to it. So you may have, line of therapy change from 1 to 2. You get a click and you go, okay, well, that was 1 to 2. But in the text box over and down to the right, you have the conversation of what actually happened and why and what you think it is. And maybe they weren't doing too well. Maybe there was a scan. We've done things that said, well, if you have a scan date plus a change in therapy equals progression, so we can kind of look at data and say that that's what we think it is. But at the same time, there's still an amazing amount of art in the practice of medicine.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, we've seen some of that as well. So this question comes from Sebastian, who's the PI of the Innovation Center. He points out that Sentinel is really focused on adverse health outcomes of interest, and that the EMR or EHR that you shared today is really curated around cancer. So cancer and cancer-related sort of comorbidities like depression and pain that you showed. What about general purpose adverse events like cardiotoxicity for people who happen to also be cancer patients? Do you look to link to claims-based information for that? I know on the slide you showed EHRs and claims and PROs potentially all linked together. So can you talk a little bit about that?
We do. I think the biggest challenge that we have just kind of off the bat is that there tends not to be the great closed claim data source where we can get 100% match between what our population, which is an all payer population, versus a closed claim data source to get really good view of that. We've done that in pockets so we can understand fractions of populations that we can extrapolate. So we will do that. The interesting thing is, and this is not answering Sebastian's question, but kind of getting to some of that too, because so many of the oncology drugs come with warnings, especially on cardiotoxicities. Those are actually measured and recorded. And one thing that's happening with the development of oncology care model and what CMMI is trying to encourage in oncology is greater capture of the comorbidities and a longitudinal view of that patient for that time. There's a recognition that you may be going to your primary care doctor before you have cancer, but when you have cancer, your oncologist becomes your primary care doctor. And so thinking through how we can make sure we're shoring up the rest of that experience, even from including being able to fill your simvastatin in the oncology in-office dispensary. So, those are slowly coming. Broad linking to claims data. I've done it in pockets. It really is the best of both worlds. It absolutely is, and we as a group need to be doing more of that and figuring that out.
Thanks, Sarah. I think we found very similar experience here. Can I ask you if any of the data that you've been using, your real-world endpoints, have been used in regulatory submissions? So
yes. That's a great question. So yes, our data were used in the approval of avelumab for metastatic Merkel cell carcinoma. So I would definitely encourage folks to go take a look at that. The interesting thing for those of us in real world data, we're trying to learn the rules as we go and understanding what the agency is interested in seeing in the data, understanding that a lot of it is just good science, and also understanding that those of us kind of in the kind of the data side don't really get to see the thoughts of the regulators unless something was approved. So it's hard to see what didn't make it. It's easier to see if we used it, but the single arm was really what carried it, but here's our opinion on the rest of it. That's been helpful in guiding. But we were used in the approval of avelumab. We've been used in the post-marketing requirements for accelerated approval. So it's not really kind of, that wasn't the initial approval, it's kind of the support of the approval in some of the presentations that were made a couple of weeks ago. So there are definitely examples of the work. I can say we're doing probably 6 studies right now that's using a historical cohort or a real world cohort in conjunction with a single arm trial. So I love it. We don't have enough patients. You know, it's if we had another half hour, I tell my trial stories, but we don't have enough patients to do the trials we've got. So we got to figure out.
Thanks, Sarah. You know, some of your old friends from Humana are in the chat box here asking some questions. And what they're wondering about is the governance issues associated with this. You've talked a lot about genomic data, a lot about unstructured data, which is very hard to de-identify. So you're probably working in all limited data sets. Yeah. What are your concerns or thoughts about using these in HIPAA and, you know, used by a federal agency? Can you comment on that?
Yeah, you know, I've learned more about HIPAA and the expert determination, de-identification, use of limited data sets than I ever thought that I was going to know about. And they never told me I was going to need that in school. But it's a really good question. So, you know, the challenges that we have in untapping the structured or the unstructured data. You know, we're using technology. We have an opportunity to provide a treatment payment operations view of the data. Most of the time, I mean, when I said earlier that we're trying to circle back to the physicians, ultimately the data that we're using should be of interest to the physicians in their practice. We shouldn't be concerning ourselves with data that aren't of relevance to them. So most of the time, what we'll try to do in collecting data or in mining unstructured data is making sure we're providing those data back to the physicians under a treatment payment operations model, which then gives us access to de-identify for secondary use. Most of the studies that we do are under IRB, of course, and thinking through that. It is, if I'm looking to the future and figuring out how we can put free text fields in a structured data feed that we send out, that's just not going to happen. Those are just way too hard to see identify. There's a breast cancer surgeon I work with that pretty much said that when she's working up a patient, she finds the first open text box and dictates everything into the first text box. And I'm like, phew, that's not really helpful. Like, I could really use it if you went through the rest of it and clicked. I'm glad you put it in there because I'll go get it, but can you just go clicky a little bit? And she's like, I just find the text box. I'm like, okay. So in that case, there's PHI galore that's going to be in that text. And I can't, you know, we've put into place PHI monitoring that can look at, you know, you start looking at key names and key fields and lengths and number of characters and all of that in a text field, but technology has to get a little bit further there.
So Sarah, I think we have time for one more question. There's been a few of like this in the chat, but essentially it's touching on something you just said, which is, you know, the idea here is real world evidence serves the physician ultimately in the generation of evidence, but at the same time, the physician's only entering things that are going to help that one patient get care. How do we bridge that gap between getting providers to think about doing more of that structured data entry for the purposes of secondary use data when it's really not their main, you know, thing at the moment?
It's a great question. We spend a lot of time with that. Part of what we're able to do from an Ontada standpoint in our relationship with US Oncology is that they know and trust us enough to know that we're not going to make them go on click sprees and do 100 different things because they think it's just going to drive us or drive a business that isn't a patient care. So there's a trust that kind of goes in there to start out with, that we may ask for things that are above and beyond what you may have thought you needed to do in that moment. But we are going to try and think through the eyes of the patient and what we think you need to be doing for the best patient care. And it's a partnership. So there are places where we've asked for a data field to be structured, and it's like, nope, not happening. And I'm like, you know, it'd be so good. Like a progression box. Did patient progress? Just click, you know, like, was this the reason? And they're like, well, but it could be many. I'm like, I know it could be many things. That's what makes this hard. I just need a box. Could you just click a box? And it's like, so that's an argument to come in the future. But it's a great question, and part of it is going to have to be partnerships between the EMR vendors. I mean, I'm just one of many vendors. They're, you know, suppliers of EMR technology, and it has to be a tool for having a conversation with a patient, not a tool that's paying a claim. And so it's reimagining what that technology even has to do. And physicians that I've talked to that start seeing it in that light understand better that there are things and sacrifices that they may have to do for a click that helps with that patient care and helps with the patient and isn't just administrative burden.
Thanks. So Dr. Stella Alwardt, thank you so much for presenting today. We are at time. As a reminder, this session has been recorded and will be made available to the Sentinel Initiative webpage. You can find all the details of future webinars that we're giving on that same page. This is going to conclude our session today. We hope you join us next time. Thank you so much for your time today. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you all.